All right, guys, so this is the Canon RP, and I've had this camera since it was first announced over 5 years ago, but something just happened. So this actually officially became the cheapest new full frame body that you can buy at B&H. And according to that spec sheet, which we'll talk about in a little bit, this has 26 megapixels, 4K video, and 4,700 autofocus points. So it definitely looks tempting at just $899. But I'm going to show you some tests on the Canon RP, a bunch of issues that you actually won't find in those spec sheets, and see if this camera is still actually worth buying in 2024. So I do think we need a little background here because 5 years ago, Canon was just kind of getting out of this phase of intentionally crippling cameras. For me, this was just one of the things that just always rubbed me the wrong way. There were a bunch of cameras like pre-2019 that I did not love for them because of things like that. So they would just intentionally remove random things. So for example, this camera did not shoot 24 frames per second in 1080p. And I think their argument at the time was that, beginners don't need 24 frames per second because that's mostly this movie format, and, most home videos are shot at 30 frames per second. That was a stupid argument. A lot of people needed 24 frames per second in this camera, and it should be in the camera. Like, there was no reason to remove it. Thankfully, they have mostly stopped that kind of practice and even fixed a few things in this camera via firmware. But there are still a few kind of weird limitations that might make this a deal breaker, even with this super awesome sale. The hardware, though, is actually kind of a plus on this camera. So obviously, this is a very small, compact, lightweight camera. So this is not like a pro-end body, and it is missing a lot of features that I personally like to have on cameras. But this is a very comfortable grip, and it does have a lot of cool features on this camera. So yeah, very comfortable, feels great in the hand, which I really like. There is a command dial on this, which you don't see on a lot of cameras. It works really well. There is no dedicated like photo video switch though. So the only way to do it is this command dial. And actually, if you're in like the manual photo modes, it's very far away from the video mode. So it's no good, easy way to switch between it. However, the video mode is very close to the automatic photo mode. So maybe that's a sign of just how they think most people are going to use this camera. But this does have a full 3-inch flip screen, and the viewfinder, it's small. It's definitely not amazing, but it is actually usable, which you don't see on a lot of small compact cameras. So really the only kind of disappointing thing in the hardware, which is kind of the result of having a small body, is that the battery is going to be a very compact battery. So the battery life is not going to be amazing, especially if you shoot video. And kind of on that video side, you actually have HDMI, you have, which actually has a clean HDMI out signal, and a mic and a headphone jack, which you actually didn't see on a lot of Canon entry-level cameras back in 2019. But there was a massive problem with this camera when it was first announced. So the camera itself, even when it was announced, was pretty cheap. So it was $1,300. So you can see this is a pretty good discount that's out right now. But Canon really only had high-end lenses. So if you wanted to kit this out with a lens, it was $2,400, which is absolutely insane. So even though the camera itself was okay, I pretty much never recommended this camera to anyone actually buy. Well, that has completely changed. So now you can actually buy this camera as a kit with a 24-105 lens, which is a huge range for a kit lens, for just $11.99. So literally you can buy two of these cameras kitted out with lenses for the same price as the cheapest RP kit when this was first announced. Now, obviously, the kit lens that comes now, the cheaper 24-105, isn't as good as the higher-end f4 version, which is the one that I use the most in the original kit. But Canon now has a bunch of lenses in this kind of like $500 price range, which are perfect for the Canon RP. I'll include some links in the description. This 35 1.8 is going to be a great example. This is an 85, which is also a 1.8 lens, which is another great example. And the really cool thing about Canon lenses is a lot of them have image stabilization inside the lens, which is double good for the RP because there is no in-body image stabilization system inside of the camera. It has digital image stabilization only. Now, one of the issues with this camera for me is going to be the frame rates. Canon says it can shoot up to 5 frames per second, which is already on the slow side. But if you're actually using this in continuous shooting with full autofocus, it drops to 3 frames per second. And that is just crazy slow for a camera like this. Again, that was just something that Canon was kind of seemingly crippling on this camera. So just kind of keep that in mind, that this is going to be tough to use for things like sports, wildlife, and even 3 frames per second with kids and family photos. You're probably going to be pushing this limit all the way. Now, image quality was another kind of mixed bag for me at the time when this first came out. But now at $900, it's actually really good for the price. So this is a 26 megapixel full frame sensor. And by itself, that is really amazing. The problem is that this particular sensor that they used, it wasn't as good as other sensors used by Canon, or not Canon, Nikon and Sony. So at the time, if you were to compare this to other full frame cameras, the dynamic range wasn't as good, overall image quality wasn't as good, and even low light, it just wasn't to the level of the competition. Now, Canon has always had very strong performance with their colors. I think this was still an example in this camera, so that's great. And now that the price is just $900, I do think it is a solid image quality upgrade from other APS-C cameras, especially in low light because it's full frame, so you have a larger sensor. It's also going to mean that you can get shallower depth of field. And comparing it now to pretty much every other camera at this price, there isn't really anything that's going to be better without spending more money. Now, autofocus. So back in 2019, autofocus on mirrorless cameras was kind of all over the place. The technology was still pretty new for a lot of manufacturers. So depending on the camera, the autofocus could always be decent or it could be pretty bad. Thankfully, the Canon RP was one of the better ones around at the time. Now, this is definitely still going to be like one of the areas that has improved massively over the years. So if you're shooting anything super challenging, sports, wildlife type things, or just anything that needs fast tracking, you might want some of the newer cameras that are out. And I'll give you some examples in a little bit. But the Canon RP was one of the first ones to have features like eye autofocus tracking, and it's still very good compared to some new cameras. And it worked in video as well. So not a bad camera at all when it comes to autofocus. It was just kind of in the early days of autofocus tracking. So the subject, it needed to be fairly close to get that eye autofocus tracking to work. And the response times just weren't amazing. So it's just not as fast as a lot of focus systems are today. But I do think that the autofocus is still very good and you can rely on it. So for most people, it's going to be absolutely fine with what it can do. Now, if you do want to shoot video with this camera, that is definitely where most of the limitations are. And compared to the competition and to pretty much every other modern camera, there's going to be a lot missing from this camera. So at the time, back in 2019, this camera couldn't even shoot 24 frames per second. So thankfully, Canon fixed that via firmware. And you do have features like a mic input, you have a headphone out and an HDMI out with clean HDMI. So those are all very good things. But this camera says it records in 4K. It kind of does, but it forces you into a 1.7 times crop, which is absolutely massive. You have this horrible rolling shutter in this mode, so you really can only use it on a tripod. And there's no autofocus at all. So to me, the 4K is going to be pretty much useless for most things. Now, 1080p on this, it's also going to be limited, so you're going to be 8-bit. There is no log profile, so it's going to be standard profiles only, and it is a very low bit rate. So basically all that means is you're not going to have a whole lot of room to be able to grade this video in post. So just make sure that you are fine with 1080p video and you're not going to do much color grading, and then you can get some pretty usable video from the Canon RP. Now, you can shoot up to 60 frames per second, so you are going to get some kind of a slow motion on that. But again, nothing to write home about. A lot of cameras could shoot 120 frames per second in 1080p. And overall for video, it's going to be kind of average at best. So definitely not going to be the reason to buy this camera. So should you actually buy it? At this price, this camera is now the cheapest full frame camera on the market, and it's definitely not the worst by any means. So there are a lot of reasons to actually buy it. I did see a Sony a7 II on B&H, which for some reason you can't buy it with a body only, so it's only available with a lens, but it is under $1,000, which sounds super cheap, but keep in mind that camera is 10 years old, which is insane. And if you're buying a 10-year-old camera, you should definitely be buying it used. Don't pay new prices for technology that's that old. and it is missing quite a few things. So probably not the ideal camera to buy. Now, if you want to stick with Canon though, your only other option at this price is going to be this camera right here. So this is the Canon R10, which is an APS-C camera, but very similar. It does have a smaller sensor, but this camera is much faster at 15 frames per second. It has significantly better autofocus, a bunch of new features on it. So if you're shooting things like sports, action, anything super fast, this is going to be probably a better camera, especially when you need that faster autofocus. And for video, this is also going to be better. Just keep in mind that pretty much every good Canon lens right now is going to be a full frame lens. So it kind of feels like if you're going to be buying these kind of full frame lenses, you might as well get a full frame camera. And that's where the Canon RP is going to have some advantages with the image quality, the shallower depth of field, and better quality in low light. Now, if you're shooting video, I definitely skip the Canon RP and go with something like the R10. Or if you have $300 more in the budget, check out the Canon R8, which is also on sale, and I do have a full review on that camera. So definitely check that out. It is still a full frame camera, so you get all of that quality, even better actually, but it does have much better video quality and features. It is significantly faster. It has a much better autofocus system, and it has a new sensor, and this new sensor is just much better quality for both photo and video, which might seem strange because it's actually only 24 megapixels, so 2 less megapixels, but it is a new sensor and it is a much better sensor. So better dynamic range and better quality overall. So definitely a splurge option if you do have that extra $300. Now, if you compare this to other brands, so Sony's only option in this kind of price range is going to be that 10-year-old camera. So unless you can swing about $1,500, Sony just doesn't have a really good competitor at this kind of a price. Now, Nikon has a camera called the Z5, which is actually a really solid camera. It is under $1,000 right now. I think it's like $1,400 with a lens, so a little bit more than the RP, but it is going to be better in actually most ways. However, it's going to be a much larger and heavier camera, and it's going to be a different brand. So if you want to stay within the Canon ecosystem and you want something super compact, the Canon RP is going to be the camera to get. It might be a little bit slow, and it doesn't really have any standout features, but it's still going to be a solid choice in that Canon ecosystem. It's going to have that full frame sensor. And if you do need faster speeds or to shoot video, you can get something like the Canon R10, which is technically a lower end camera. It's just much newer, which is why it has all of those features on it. Or you can make the jump to the Canon R8, and both of those are going to be amazing options. But hit me up with your thoughts on this camera, especially if you have the Canon RP. I'd love to know what you think of it so far. I do have links to this camera and all of the sales going on, all of my favorite lenses, memory cards, accessories that you need to buy for it. So check that out in the description. And there are some really big Canon announcements that have been hitting this week. So subscribe and stay tuned because big things are about to happen.